Hello and welcome to this video on name of origin labels and control. You may wonder what that means, and it is best put in context and explained by an example. Champagne, the bubbling luxury of the wine world. Champagne is defined by the geographical boundaries of the Champagne region of France under specific rules for production. There are bottles of sparkling wine produced elsewhere, and these are referred to as champagne in the generic sense. They are legally not allowed to be labelled as champagne, with very limited exceptions. Because they are not produced in the highlighted regions, they are not allowed to be labelled. However, this designation and others is a relatively new thing. It came about from a series of restrictive agreements and attempts to protect the name, nature and status of different labels and products. As a consequence, the example of champagne is labelled as sparkling wine in any region but that highlighted. This protects their product from bad publicity arising from bad wine and protects their economic interests. Part of this restriction is a World Trade Organization agreement. This is known as the TRIPS agreement. This is the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Aspect Agreement. The agreement is like the famous quote on democracy by Churchill. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. This is said in terms of the fact that TRIPS makes a mess of this particular situation, but without it, it is an even worse mess, and thereby it brings some order to the system of trade and rights that exist in a free trade economy. As a consequence of the preferential treatment wine and spirits get, the following content is made much simpler, but also harder and more specific. This is because TRIPS creates a minimum standard of protection for labels and creates a unilateral agreement that protections must be enforced in all countries, meaning that designations protected in one country must generally be protected elsewhere. This is where Australia and the USA got in trouble several years ago. They were selling champagne produced domestically. So to begin, the TRIPS agreement begins by stating that the country of origin must protect its geographically restrained products. In the case of champagne, this is done and has been since the mid-19th century. This was first enforced in the 1880s and reinforced in two agreements of 1891. Between the two sets of agreements and the TRIPS, in circa 1936, the French government brought in a designation which roughly translated as Appellation Designating Control. This defined the geographical boundary for champagne. Further, it restricted processing and production methods. This satisfies the first requirement for TRIPS. And the first requirement of TRIPS is to make clear the source and origin. More than that though, it is an appellative. The appellation covers the product's characteristics, and in the case of champagne, these are the very things that identify it, and creates a circular argument about champagne being called champagne, or described as champagne because it is champagne. The final restrictive part of the TRIPS agreement is the geographical identification, and this is where champagne is a contentious point. It defines a region in France. However, there are other locations such as a village in Switzerland that have the name Champagne and produce wine they call champagne. The final and most recent iteration is the 1995 TRIPS agreement, and this helps. Because champagne is used in a generic fashion, it should meet the requirements of the TRIPS to be allowed to be used in everything. But the agreement allows a country to deny the use of a term in a generic manner domestically. As a consequence of this, France has and had used the power to deny the right as a means of enforcing a domestic restriction, and that domestic restriction is now honoured by other sovereign nations because of the unilateral requirements. This led to champagne being defined as a collective or certification mark in the US. This means that bottles can use this, so long as it makes clear where it originates from, that it is not from the Champagne region, and that it follows very specific guidelines that have been issued. This is a schism between the US and European Union system of implementation of the agreement. It is something of a old world versus new world argument. The other factor to apply here is that the collective or certification mark must be issued by a governing body, and that governing body must be recognized and able to enforce these essentially collective or certification mark standards. Overall, the reason why champagne is protected owes to the roughly 200 years of development and refinement that went into their product. They are now trying to keep that product distinct and separate from companies, vineyards, and brewers who would compete, and who would directly benefit from their work without compensation. This being a labor-intensive process that is financially beneficial to them and embodies their identity. Considering this example, control of label of origin and similar systems exist for several reasons. They indicate the origin, they retain prestige, they protect economic interests, and ensure quality through certification, among other mechanisms. Although it is not restricted to wine, it is an important concept and has applications in other things, particularly spirits and wines, as they are given their own protections within the TRIPS agreement, but other categories as well. It affects products like balsamic vinegar and cheese, like the Stilton cheese, these two being examples of non-fermented products that are given significant protections under the agreement. This video is by no means exhaustive or entirely restrictive in its content, but simply provides some of the key highlights and high points as to why champagne, among other items, are protected, and particularly with regards to the name of origin labeling. There are far better researched and far better constructed arguments and explanations available, and I'll link to several of those below. Thank you for watching this video. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you may have below.